Great. Good morning, everyone. It's like time to start. Welcome to week 6, our weekly show, sixth episode, the yin and yang of a risk and a resilience. All the recordings are available. If someone has missed, you may like to access those. Today, we are going to talk about integration of a risk and a resilience. And without spending any more time, let's go ahead. My name is Daman Dev Sood, about 38 years in the industry, 18 years in resilience domain, multiple roles, multiple awards, BCI Hall of Fame, 8 books already, 9th book is getting released globally on 15th Monday, 8 p.m. IST. I request you all to join me. We have talked a lot in the past when we talk of risk and crisis, that there should be an opportunity in every crisis, there should be an opportunity in every risk, or there is an opportunity in risk and crisis, but very difficult to find the practical, real examples. Through this slide, I'm attempting to show that at least during COVID-19 pandemic, which was a big crisis across globe, we saw those examples, such examples. So this helps us to understand what happened or was done in COVID-19 pandemic management could be done with other risks and other crises also. So starting from the top left-hand side, when COVID-19 pandemic happened, that was a risk that came. Perhaps most of us were not prepared for it. It was mitigated by the governments by announcing the lockdowns. So a risk happened and a mitigation was done or a control was put in place. Lockdown started. And in risk management, we have to keep this in mind, this concept also, that while we manage a risk, it may give rise to another risk. Actually, we should attempt that it doesn't. But it happened. Lockdowns created another risk about the livelihood. The companies couldn't work. So companies came into picture to have mitigation, which was to work from home. Almost the whole world worked from home. Again, a risk mitigated, managed, but were many multiple risks associated with working from home. Some of those, like physical security and information security of office, cannot be met at home, or even if we say working from anywhere, working remotely. Now, we are not saying work from home, perhaps. We say working remotely. But if that remote is not our office, then the physical security and information security is compromised. That's a risk. Then fatigue, people while working at home from home, but perhaps working 17, 18 hours, not 8, 9, 10 hours, gave rise to stress also. And perhaps gyms were closed, so we all were sitting long hours. That could have impacted internally, even if it has or it didn't come out at that time. There have been some cases, reports that number of home violences increased and number of divorces increased during that period. So all those were the negative impacts or side impacts or the risks created by work from home, which actually was a mitigation to an earlier risk that offices were closed or got closed, had to be locked immediately overnight. Up to an extent, that risk was also mitigated. For example, either NDAs were refreshed or were written then, or code of conducts were reminded, or some controls were put in place through IT. Maybe some updates in some policies also. No one perhaps would have done full study. At that time, we all were struggling. We were struggling to just be alive, if I may use that word. So work was important, perhaps side effects were forgotten. But this is what I would like to say in BCM now or in resilience, that work from home should be a temporary measure, or work from any place other than office should be a temporary measure only. It shouldn't be a long-term solution. Long-term solution for building failure, which was the case in pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. Long-term solution has to be another workplace only, not home, not remote. There are many, many more risks associated with that solution. About a year and a half had gone during that COVID-19 pandemic period. And when the talk started for return to office, this is the green portion in the slide. And that would give a risk rise to another risk. Offices were closed, not offices, the whole world was closed. Malls were closed, so that we could stay away from each other. The distance had to be increased. That's why offices were closed. Do not come to office. Stay at home. At home, perhaps 2, 3, 4, 10 people were together. But outside the home, that could have become 100,000 people also. So that's why this separation was done. But when people were asked to come back, that proximity once again could increase the chances of spread. Mitigation, we would say now if you were sitting 2 people in 1.5 meters, now you say 2 people in 3 meters, which means number of people that could be allowed in the office reduced. Our capacities in the offices reduced. We had to have many PPE kits. We had to have sanitizers in large amounts. That was an additional expenditure, so risk once again. To mitigate that, companies would either have to charge premium on their products. If they charge premium, perhaps the sales would go down. And if they don't charge premium, they wouldn't charge premium, then their profitabilities would be taking hit. So we are seeing multiple layers here. Very good example, or the best example available to us to see this, that managing one risk could give rise to another risk. Quarantine was required if someone was either found positive or even if suspected. Daman, go home, stay at home for 5, 7, 10, 14 days, which means loss of productivity. So once again, we are managing one risk, asking person to stay at home, but that gives rise to another risk, which is the productivity, loss of productivity. Increased medical costs, whether it was personal or whether it was in the office, including the sanitizers and PPE kits, I'm saying. Medical costs, at least in India, we know, initially perhaps that treatment of COVID-19 pandemic was not covered through our medical policies. The regulator had to come into picture, and it was the directive by the insurance that the existing policies also should take care of COVID-19 pandemic treatment. Personally, I do not know whether anyone had to claimed, and whether that claim was then paid by the company. But at least the regulator came into picture to manage that risk once again. The last point that I'm saying is, theoretically, a pandemic, and during COVID-19 pandemic also, the worst case scenario could be that up to 70% people could be missing from office, impacted, at home, sick, taking care of sick, dead, unfortunately. That number could be up to 70%. And if you were saying for 15 days you get quarantined, assume we were lucky 70% were alive but were sick for 70 days, 15 days, sorry, if someone would have to stay at home, average salary, then what was the cost of this? This is huge. How was this covered? I wouldn't have any figures from any company as of now. So while moving on, I'm just attempting to say once again that in the past we used to struggle for this example. COVID-19 pandemic gave very good example. Two cases. One was that when we manage one risk, it may give rise to another risk. And very good example that we kept managing those risks again and again. It became a very long chain. The next slide, then the second portion that we always keep looking forward to, a risk giving rise to opportunity or finding an opportunity in a risk or in a crisis. Once again, COVID-19 pandemic was a very good example for us. And we'll take India's story, moving from a zero to hero. In the beginning, there were not enough PPE kits in whatever was available, most likely was being imported and most likely being imported from China. But garment industry, which otherwise would have been locked, shifted their way of working. They started stitching the PPE kits. So one is they survived. We may call it an innovation. I would like to call it an innovation, even if it was a small idea by anyone, someone. And later on today, perhaps India is not only not importing, but perhaps exporting the PPE kits. Similar example for a vaccine. India story is very good story there. About 1.3 at that time or 1.25 billion people at that time were taken care of. And not only that, India supported many other countries also. Even if there was not business in that, not making money, or some money also would have come. But that was an excellent example of this innovation improvement or an opportunity in crisis. We all know that perhaps some rules were also relaxed. A vaccine may take 10, 15 years to come into market, but the whole world, the authorities then changed their stance and quick approvals were given for these vaccines. Not only in India, other countries also. For example, was sanitizers. Once again, agriculture, sugar industry. The byproduct would be alcohol, and they started manufacturing sanitizers from sugar cane. Excellent example, I'll again say. Due to which, initially, there were less supplies were short and costs were high. And later on, we had ample supplies of sanitizers and within the reach or good reach, I would say. The last example, I would like to say ventilators also. There were not enough number of ventilators available in India, at least. I understand it was generally the case anywhere in the world because no one was prepared to have so many people being in hospitals needing ventilators. No one had ever calculated, estimated, thought of that situation. The auto industry started making ventilators. These stories are available. I wouldn't have written proofs with me, but it's good to narrate these to understand. At least that is happening in this world. And before I hand over to Anand, I would like to narrate a poem not written by me. Someone else has written, but I have just attempted to give my perspective to that. Give me a few seconds, please. So what is risk? A poem on risk, surprising that there could be a poem about risk also. To laugh is to risk appearing the fool. To laugh is to risk appearing a fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach for another is to risk involvement. To expose your feeling is to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas, your dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. So we keep hiding. That's a big challenge we have. My BC plan. I created this. So this is confidential and it's my property. I will not share with anyone. That actually becomes a big risk. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To live is to risk dying, but we know death is inevitable. So we must live to the full. This is where it starts getting into resilience also. We need to be resilient in personal life also. To believe is to risk despair, sorry. To try is to risk failure. But if I don't try, I wouldn't succeed. To manage this risk, very simple. What I have done in the last 10 years or so from my life, I have removed a couple of words. I never say I try. I say I attempt. I never say I have a problem. There are no problems in my life. There may be challenges, which I will keep managing. This is my personal risk management. But if you don't try, if you don't attempt, we will not succeed at all. And there are so many stories, so many other phrases when we say that failure is not failure, actually, it's an attempt towards success, etc., etc. But risk must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. This is pure business as well. There is no gain without pain. The people who risk nothing, do nothing, have nothing, are nothing. They may avoid suffering and sorrow, but they cannot learn, feel, change, grow, love, live. Whoever has written this, great salute to that person, he or she. I'm repeating this last one. This is very good. We are moving from failure to success towards being resilient by managing risks. They may avoid suffering and sorrow, but they cannot learn, feel, change, grow, love, live. Chained by their attitudes, they are slaves. They have forfeited their freedom. Only a person who risks is free. I'm skipping this right portion because I have given my commentary in between while I was reading the poem. That poem was more important. With this, I would like to hand it over to Anand. This is our sixth session, the yin and yang of risk and resilience. Over to you, Anand.
Thanks, Daman. Thanks for setting a very good context to the next set of slides that are coming up. And again, very good morning to everyone here who's looking at this presentation today. Quick introduction about myself. I'm today founder of a risk and technologies consulting startup. And prior to this, I was the chief risk and compliance officer of an NYSE listed Indian company. My area of practice has been risk management for the last 15 years. And prior to that, about 10 years in business finance. At this moment, the idea here is to be able to, collaborate on this topic of current interest in many companies, which is how is risk and resilience, how can risk and resilience be looked at together and not as silos. So with that, I move forward. Happy to take this session. So the idea here is that every company that we work in, they would like to believe that they are an ever flourishing organization, which means that if they've started now, they want to be 100 years. If they are 100 years, they want to be 1,000 years. And the manner in which they become ever flourishing, if you look at it from the dimension of financials, right, you want to ensure that the trajectory of growth, whether it is profitability or whether it is anything which is non-financial but objective, they grow disproportionately. They grow without much of interruption. They grow without much of risks, right? But we also understand that depending on what industry we are in, so we could be operating in a very risky industry, such as the airline industry, where the industry fundamentals itself are very strong, right, in terms of risks. Or you could be operating a business where the potential risks and disruptions from within or outside are quite a lot. So in either of these cases, um, the idea here is what can risk and resilience do for you, or how can risk and resilience thinking help you make sure that this goal of growing year after year, becoming an ever flourishing organization, is something that is not that is preserved, right? So the goal is preserved, the path is preserved, the value is preserved, right? So that's the combined benefit that one would get if they look at risk and resilience together. So if you had to look at it and think of what kind of levers could exist, Damanji, the next. So in order to achieve this, we've looked at risks in different ways. We've looked at resilience also in the past. But at the end of the day, if you want to summarize all of this, right, this is more a summarization session. If you want to summarize all of this, uh, I would say that there are three levers where the silos of risk and resilience can be broken, and organizations can traverse across the path that we had talked about earlier. One is to be able to master the risk and loss cycle. You would recollect this, and I'm going to move to the next slide very quickly about at what point in time a risk then traverses on to become a loss, which then has to be managed in order to ensure that the crisis is averted or a business continuity scenario comes to life, right? So mastering that risk loss cycle for an organization can become a very valuable input. The second is there are so many things that cannot be done unless and until the business model itself can be fixed. So it's very important to not look at just resilience within the operations of the company or the people, but also the business model itself, right? And we'll talk about what dimensions of those resilience would probably help organizations going forward uh, in a couple of minutes. And thirdly, for people who are basically looking at governance, right? So people who are supporting organizations and making sure that risk management and say BCM or resilience is carried out regularly, properly, what kind of integration levers are possible, right? From a process and governance perspective, not from a design perspective, not from a conceptual perspective, but from a process and governance perspective. So those are the three components or three levers that I'd like to talk about today. Daman, if you could just help us get to this. Yeah, the first one, you would recollect this very familiar graph. The As we understand, every risk that may be identified and acted upon may not necessarily be managed well. It's quite possible that a risk event or an incident can happen because you may not have identified all the risks in time or appropriately, right? Or the vulnerabilities and challenges that may have existed, or the inadequacy of the mitigation plans may have caused the event or incident to play out, uh, despite the best efforts of management and organization. And that's where you enter into the loss. Daman, if you could just- So the idea here really is that there are these two windows that one needs to manage, right? And when we say mastering the risk loss cycle, what we mean to say is how can we expand these windows? How can we stretch the time that is available to us, the decision time that is available to us, so that we have enough we have enough of abilities created to handle that particular problem, right? So if we have to look at, for example, the risk management, so the idea really is to go further backwards, right? So today, what you start working on is to look at your risks in the way that it is brought to you, which means someone is actually telling you there's a problem or a challenge, and that then gets into your repository of risks, and then you start working. Now, what can you do to make sure that you don't have to wait for someone to come and tell you? How can you take it, further behind? So that is the way that you could probably manage your risk management. So when it comes to crisis management windows, obviously there are a series of technical preparations that are required. It could be to ensure that at any point in time you are not exposing the organization into a very high severity event, and therefore the recovery becomes a lot more easier. It could be that your crisis management plans, your BC plans are tested very regularly and fixed, so that when the problem occurs, you are in a position to resolve it. Uh, it's quite possible that there could be other ways in which your crisis management can be expanded, or the quality of that crisis management can be better, right? So this we understand conceptually, and what I will cover in the next slide, Damanji, is to be able to go a little bit, I would say, deeper on the model side, as well as on the earlier side that I talked about. So if I have to go earlier, backwards, right, from a risk assessment or a risk management thought process, my first effort that I would do as an organization is to start observing the shifts, right? So broadly, the topic is called either emerging risk identification or signal detection. So that's the process that a lot of companies are starting to embark on, because at least the risk teams are starting to embark on, because they understand that not every risk can be picked up or at the right time. And so you consciously start hunting for patterns, hunting for shifts that are happening. And these shifts can happen in multiple ways. Shifts can happen in the form of geopolitical choices that countries are making. As the country itself, we've had this very unique dilemma of siding with countries during say the Russia-Ukraine war, for example. And how do you go about thinking about how that war can impact us as a country first, and then as a business next. So these shifts are very important. There's been shift in the past towards nationalization, right? There's a shift from a geopolitical point of view, to say that we want to move away from China. Say a China plus one policy is being adopted by all customers across the globe. And this creates obviously an opportunity for Indian companies. But then those shifts can also, be counterproductive in certain cases, to say that we would want, local manufacturing in US or local manufacturing in Europe, uh, perhaps because the climate footprint is very high. So the drivers for why those shifts can happen can be several, but it's very important to keep studying those changing shifts. And those shifts are not just happening at the country level, it's also happening at a customer level, right? Customers are choosing to consolidate, customers are choosing to change their vendors, customers are again looking for choices that are both in the company's control, in our control, as well as may not be in our control. And it's definitely important for us to feel comfortable in the normal. So this is the normal BAU, I would say, right, where change is constant. Change can also happen at the workplace, for example, right? So it's very important for risk management teams, and I'm using this word very specifically right now, but anybody in the organization, it's very important to start being able to pick up these signals and then see how quickly we can act upon it. Connecting the dots is very, very important. Daman gave a fantastic, example of how this first year, second year, third tier risk could get generated, using an example that all of us can actually connect with. But the same thing can happen, in areas like climate risk, in an area like the pandemic that very clearly we've written,
Yeah.
from a supply chain perspective, say, for example, right? And it's important for us to be able to relate it. A lot of companies today are asked to talk about, say, climate risk and their impacts, and we find it very difficult to be able to say, if the polar ice caps are melting, why should my company get impacted, right? Or if the Earth's temperature on an average is going to go up by another 1 or 2 degrees, what kind of changes are likely to happen to my business in the next couple of years or in the next decade? I think those kind of questions are being now asked, but it is very important for us to build the capability to do that. And I think these are very important elements to have as you want to move back, right? What is generally visible around you, what is experienced by other companies, definitely will be able to catch that fast, or what your colleagues say. But observing these trends and creating your own independent, I would say, methodology of trying to figure this out without actually, depending on someone else's point of view. I think that's a skill set that's very important. So that signal detection, I would say, is clearly to the left of that earlier graph that we saw. Very, very important skill set to pick up. In many ways, it prepares you for any possible risks. In many ways, it's a different way of actually communicating that you're a more resilient organization, thinking ahead as well, right? The second pillar that is here on the slide is the business model resilience. Sorry, Daman, was there something you wanted to speak? No, right? Okay, great. No, no, absolutely. So the second pillar is the business model resilience pillar. And of late, this is becoming very, very important for us. There are several industries where, for example, you would find that the fixed cost element is very high, which means that as the business falls down by 30%, 40%, 50%, you're already incurring a loss, right? So some industries have been very careful about this. You would always find, for example, the construction industry, right? The EPC industry. They normally subcontract everything, right? So they keep their business models highly flexed. It may not be possible for all, industries to do that, but to the extent possible, I think it is worth, for management to look at highly flexed business models. And these business models should consider synergies of different kind, right? For example, we've seen that the during the time of COVID, there was one not very long drawn, but a very specific point in time initiative that ITC had signed up with Domino's. So the challenge that Domino's had was that people were not ordering food because they were scared of contamination, but they were ordering provisions, right? And ITC being a hotel industry, for example, I think they or even supermarkets and retail, we didn't have people going in and buying as much as possible. So the whole deal was that ITC used the vehicles of Domino's and started doing home delivery of provisions and other retail goods for that matter. So this was a very unique thing at that point in time, just like the way the hybrid working. And I'm not talking a lot about it because the organization that pioneered this has actually backflipped it to say that we want everybody to come back to office. But the philosophy of hybrid working has stayed and become extremely strong till today. And I think this is a permanent shift that has happened to the business model, right? So in many ways, it by default reduces, I would say, the cost of operations. But then, like Daman said, it's very important for us to also visualize and see what is the impact to the downstream risks as a result of making some risk mitigation choices or response choices, right? But I think fixing the business model, resilience is extremely important. A lot of organizations since the COVID period, and we must have seen a lot of these reports that are there put out there on digital, to say that digitization can help achieve a lot of the de-risking efforts that are there. And in the past, digitization used to happen a lot more on the non-core areas, I would say. And now, even in the core areas, I think digitization is being pushed in a great way. This could be in manufacturing, for example. This could be in R&D, for example. Um, and the idea here is that you want to make sure that on one hand, you don't have dependency on elements such as people, where if there is a problem, then you won't know what to do because they are your core areas. And secondly, it is also to be agile and relevant during the current, world's context. So if your lead times have to reduce dramatically, if your ability to supply has to go up in terms of, customer requirements, all of these, I think, requires a certain degree of, automation that helps you move things fast and get to know where your problem is and fix them. So a lot of companies have chosen to go for digitization and automation, and it kind of just ramped up a lot during the last 4 5 years. So As a business model, I think it's very important for you to use these thoughts to see if you can fix some of the potential challenges that might come when a risk starts playing out, right? And the last one, from a finance standpoint, I would say from the way the funds of the organization are being used, there are two things which I have at least felt was very important. One is the concept of contrarian investments, right? So when we say contrarian investments, every company today works in a certain industry, and there is a certain way in which the working capital, cash flows, fund flows get generated through the business cycles. So, for example, if you take the infrastructure industry, the EPC industry again, right? So we say that they are prone by default to 5-year economic cycles. So it means that every 5 years there could be an upswing, and then there could be a downswing, and then again there's an upswing. So what happens when you are in a cyclical industry and when you're on a down cycle? How do you then prepare yourself for down cycles? I think the fundamental concept here is that can you allocate a portion of your business surplus or working capital or portfolio, right? It could be in terms of cash, could be in terms of just the business model itself, on a business that is opposite of this, right? So during a downturn, during the time when, let's say, things are down, for example, you might find that a real estate or value of gold goes up, say, for example, right? So do you want to think about such businesses where in the normal business cycle, when one thing goes down, that other backup plan actually shoots up during that time? So we look at contrarian investments from that perspective. In short, you're trying to diversify your risk and make sure that all the things that go down don't go down at the same time, right? And that's the fundamental thought process. Again, it has to be done at a very structural level, to put it differently, in a corporate level. The other one, which I think nobody expected, from a resilience or a BCM perspective, is to imagine a scenario where there is no business for a long period of time, right? We have certain industries such as the tourism industry, hotel industry, right? All of these people were off business for months and sometimes quarters, right? If not years. And I think in a year or two, a lot of them went bankrupt. The idea here is, again, while your industry may or may not be susceptible to problems such as the COVID kind of woke us up and told us that anything can happen, where a no business kind of scenario could also exist, right? So, is there a scenario or a situation where not a single customer, you're not able to service a single customer for a long period of time, not because of fault at your end, right? And that is where it is worth keeping in mind and thinking about a no business kind of a scenario in your stress testing models or in your cash scenario models. Um, there could be a BC plan that could say that, how am I, kind of preparing for this, or how am I prepared for this, right? It's worth thinking about it. Each industry is different, each size of the company is different. What is the backup plan is very different. But I think it is something worth thinking, right? So I've taken it at a 10,000 feet level, because I think at the design level, some of these things, if they are not corrected at an operational level, it may or may not matter. You may still have the best BCM programs in place, but if a company is unable to survive during a no business scenario, nothing can be done. So it's good to look at it all the way, and that's what this particular slide talks about. Please carry on, there. And the third component which I talked about was primarily at the way that we work, risk professionals such as you and I work. And the idea is that companies have started asking, how can we integrate risk and resilience thinking together the way we work? We do not want to have people think about risk differently and resilience differently. We don't necessarily want to have two sets of ideologies flowing within the company. We do not want to have separate teams that are working on these topics, ideally, right? And we definitely want to make sure that from an administrative perspective, or from an overall efficiency perspective, we do not you know, we do not end up duplicating a lot of efforts, right, and energies. So if we look at it from a process and governance perspective, essentially there are three, I would say, steps. The first is the ground level, where how do we work with information? How do we do risk management? How do we go about doing our basic process of either risk or resilience BCP kind of a domain. The second is at a governance level, and the third is at a reporting level. Now, at the base level, one approach that we are trying to explore is to see that can these risk assessments actually be combined. And this doesn't have to just be with enterprise risk or risk management and resilience. This could expand to any area of risk domain, right? So I could be looking at information security risk. I could be looking at quality and safety risk. I could be looking at multiple risk areas. Why should we look at different risks as different silos or domains? Because at the end of the day, all of these are risks to the companies, accepting that they happen at different levels. Some impact business and some impact operations. At the end of the day, they are all risks to the organization. So, is there any merit in combining these risk assessments, at least beginning from risk and resilience and then taking it to other areas? So that's an area that we are exploring, and it seems that there is definitely a lot of synergies possible there. And that also means that when you start working on your mitigations, on your crisis management plans, on your contingencies, on your BC plans, you're looking at all of them very holistically, right? You're not looking at risk as a separate risk register with their own mitigation plans, and here a BC plan and a crisis management plan with its own plans, not necessarily connected with risk or connected with risk. So the world actually of the way projects are run to manage risks are all already integrated, right? So that's what we are also trying to see if that can happen. Because the nature of the response shouldn't worry about what risk it addresses. As long as it's a project, that project has been initiated, that project could it could actually correct a risk, and it could correct a business continuity issue at the same time, right? Equally importantly, it's important for people to understand the relationship between risk and resilience, or risk and BCM in this context, and how one can influence the other, and where does one begin and where does one end, and how do they end up complementing each other, or actually supporting each other. Now, one paradigm or one view that I had presented, in an earlier slide is probably a very easy to understand view, and that could be used. But at the end of the day, uh, when we say that a company is good in managing its risks, it must be good at predicting risks, it must be good at solving crisis, and it must be good at being able to maintain its brand and reputation in the market, right? While it is profitably growing. So if you're doing all of this and not growing, that is also a risk to your company. So it's important to be able to do all of this simultaneously, and for that, it's very important to align the thinking, right? And the thinking in this particular line says risk and BCM. So this could be risk, BCM, operations, business, anyone, right? From the point of view of business. And then opportunities to embed. So when we say embed, we basically mean that we don't have a separate line item or a language called risk management. My day-to-day job description, my day-to-day process SOP, my day-to-day policy automatically incorporates elements of risk and resilience. And I don't have to separately sit and think about a risk or a resilience. So if I'm doing my job, basically risk management is also done. So that is taking it to the ultimate level, and it's not something that can be done overnight. So we're consciously trying to say that it can be done once the concept is first understood and practiced individually, and then slowly it is incorporated into the official DNA of the company, which are your policies and procedures and job descriptions, right? So that's at the ground level. At the governance level, it is very important that we are able to align the frameworks very appropriately. And by this, what I mean is, I mean, we would have worked in organizations where you have an audit report, you have a compliance report, you might have an ERM report, and so many other ways in which you might be representing, say, IFC and SOX and all of this. And everywhere you would have a red, amber, green rating. Everywhere you would know what a high, moderate, low means. But will they be talking to one another? No, right? So they don't talk to one another because they created at different points in time by different sets of people who have not necessarily talked to one another. It's very important for all of us to align with each other. Today, we can again start with something like BCM ERM and see how they talk to one another. Where should they start talking to one another, right? It is obviously understandable that they don't have to be exactly the same, but how does one sink in with the other, so that when some management, some board, some stakeholder externally understands that when we say this is a high risk, that high actually is meant the same across the company. It doesn't change because it's audit, it doesn't change because it's compliance. And that is something that is really a massive effort that is required. A lot of companies today struggle to do that for the simple reason that they are not able to get themselves together at the same table and talk. But if they did that, then I think aligning that would be fantastic. But in this case, for example, one way to look at this could be that the levels of criticality that you define in BCM could be derived from, say, a level of severity in ER. So that could be one way to look at it. There can always be other ways too. And even from the management perspective, we do not want to have a separate committee for risk, a separate committee for BCM, a separate committee for, say, information security. Why not have, one common leadership or management council, right? Who actually looks at all of these risks. Again, they don't have to necessarily look at it from a siloed perspective, but it is important for us to cover all the disciplines or domains that we typically understand, right? So from a governance perspective, it is very clear it's very easy to combine the uh, uh, oversight through the leadership. And yes, there is going to be some effort in combining the frameworks, but it is definitely a doable, activity, and it would generate a lot of, I would say, clarity and value across the company if there is an integration of all of these so-called assurance functions, right? And finally, from a reporting perspective, I think it's important for organizations to be able to speak both risk and resilience in the same breath, rather than say, okay, risk, this is Anand who's going to come and speak about risk, and this is Daman who's going to come and speak about resilience. I think whoever is the spokesperson of the company should be able to speak both in the same breath. And that representations may happen to any stakeholder, particularly customers, because customers are very concerned about, say, their supply deliveries, they're concerned about compliance, they're concerned about the organization's well-being, because only when they do well will their supplies also be guaranteed and assured, right? And lastly, but not the least, your internal and external reporting. So, like I said, you don't want to have an integrated report where each of the high, moderate, lows have to be understood differently just because, different people are created at different points in time. As well as when we're speaking from an external reporting perspective also, whether it is the structure that, we want to communicate, or whether it is the policy or the process that we want to communicate, or whether it is the outcome that we want to communicate in terms of saying how we are managing our risk. I think all of these can be combined, right? Can be looked at in an integrated. Right now, we are trying to get into doing this for one of our clients, and I think it's really worth spending some time and fixing this at a conceptual level. But there is clearly a possibility and an opportunity to do this and do it well. Over to you, then.
Oh, great.
So
Thank you.
that was the last slide. Just wanted to give a quick snapshot of the three levers that could exist: master the risk loss cycle, fix the business model, or evaluate your business model, make your business model more flexible, and finally at the process and governance level. With that, we've kind of concluded, session 6. Um, uh, Krishnan, if you have any questions or thoughts, very happy to take it. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to Daman.
Yeah, again, as I said, as you said, sir, operational level BCM risk is pretty much somewhere else in that sense, right?
Right.
Some people are talking about risk. A different set of people are talking about business continuity planning, and not necessarily that one is essentially connected to the other. So yeah, again, a lot of food for thought here, things to discuss internally and try and implement. And of course, again, it's not going to be overnight. It's going to take time. But yes, that's the as they say, that's part of the job when you say that continual improvement. This will have to be one of it. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. And then quickly, one question.
Yes, please.
Going back to the slide while I'm not showing it. Those three pillars on slide 2.
Yes.
The
Yes.
third pillar
Yes.
and the bottom of the pillar.
Yes.
It seems to me that's the scariest scenario when there is no business for a long period, 6, 12, 18, perhaps 2 years we saw during COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll say we all, most of us, I will say, have been lucky. We survived. Most survived. As we know, there are some people, individuals, and some companies also. Most likely, small companies. Big companies have all survived somehow.
Right.
Will we be able to do this again? So, I mean, that seems to be the scariest situation, worst case
I
scenario.
think it's a very loaded question, Daman, and I think the same problem may not come. It could be a different problem.
Which
You
will be
know,
added challenge, by the way. Today, we claim that we have managed COVID-19 pandemic. We know that, and we will be able to do it again. If it's a different scenario, different risk or disaster or crisis that is forcing us to be shut for a long period, that'll be a bigger challenge. Yeah.
I think it's very important to be cognizant of the fact that such a scenario may exist, and we don't know how or why, right? The other reason why this could go away is because the industry itself is disrupted, right? That industry itself becomes non-relevant because of technology or because of any other disruption that is carried out. But we are not talking about that right now. That should get covered in risk management and get addressed appropriately. I think the only thing that I could say is that this is not new to the world of startups. So in the startup world, when you get started, when you get funding, or when you look at your what they call as runway, which is how many months of cash do you have before you go broke. I think the philosophy that goes into understanding that has to be the same philosophy that companies follow here, which means that typically companies, when they start looking at the way they utilize their surplus money, how do they use that money is something that is worth rethinking. Do they park some money and keep it even if it's not going to give them a superior, return on capital employed, and give themselves that 6 months or 12 months of time? It's very important to think about. But equally importantly is that previous line, which talks about diversification, right? So if you're going to get into an industry where you can't pivot very fast, and these are words that I can speak very confidently as a startup person. When it's a very large company, it's very difficult to say that I have 6 manufacturing plants, I want to pivot to something. But the examples you gave during COVID are also the pivots which were carried out by some of the organizations during that time, right? So I think the pivot strategy, I've not included that consciously as a statement. I think this pivot strategy also should be thought about in case there's a fundamental risk to the industry itself, right? And it's not about cash flow or non-availability of business, but fundamental threat or existential threat to the industry itself. If there is something like that, then I think a pivot strategy may not be a very bad idea, or a diversification strategy definitely.
Great. Thank you very much. With this, my attempt, Anand, is that a call to CEOs and CFOs. I have been saying that for long. One of the strategies should be to create a fund, an emergency fund. Every year, we will keep
Yes.
something added into that. And some year when we do not have business, we would be able to utilize it from. So it's a call, serious call to all CEOs, CFOs through this session, yin and yang of risk and resilience, to start looking into this. We all have been talking of BC plans, but we need to have a serious look at this portion. BC plans or crisis management plans, I would say the business plan itself should be talking about that. B, B of BCM is business. The day we think of business, we need to think the B of business quality management. That should be our approach, I believe. With this, then we would like to end the session. Thank you very much, everyone. Part 6 or episode 6, today we were talking of opportunities from, through, risk and resilience, and integration of these two. A relatively new concept for us, we can say, integration of risk and resilience. A lot of work still to be done. We are attempting, as Anand said, an experiment, we would say, as of now, and we'll be happy to come back with the results. We still have 2 more episodes to go. Next 2 Saturdays, the same time, 10 a.m. IST. We look forward to seeing you all. Till that, have a great time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. Thanks, Naman.
Bye.
Good day to all of you.